It's the Alex Jones Show. I am Jason Bermas sitting in. We are joined by Peter Dale Scott, who I sat down with last October, and he was gracious enough to give me an hour and 40-minute interview for my film, Invisible Empire and New World Order Defined. And one of the things we did talk about was CIA involvement in drug running in the past and even today in modern times. But at the time, this New York Times article had not come out yet, and you were actually alluding to this in our interview, saying that there had been some Russian journalists and sources out there that said that we were very much involved in the opium trade in Afghanistan. And then we had this headline, October 28, 2009, brother of Afghan leader said to be paid by the CIA. And this is, of course, Ahmed Wali Karzai. You go into this later in the article, Peter. But how is it that we've set up an infrastructure that is openly using a drug lord, who just happens to be our puppet dictator's brother, as the lead opium dealer in the region? How does this happen?
Well, twice over, first time in 1979 and again in 2001 after 9/11, the CIA went into Afghanistan. It didn't have very many assets there to choose from, and the assets it chose happened to be drug traffickers. And its hands were not totally free in this matter, because the first time, which was the crucial decision in 1979, it was trying to stay as remotely from operations as possible. So it supplied a great deal of money to what we call the ISI, which is the Pakistan Intelligence Service. Pakistan was actually frightened of Afghan independence because there's an unresolved border issue between Afghanistan and Pakistan. So Pakistan gave the money, or more than half of the money, to its preferred client who had a base in Pakistan but not in Afghanistan. And he became, with the aid of the CIA money, perhaps the world's largest heroin trafficker in the 1980s. He not only was dealing in opium, but he developed heroin labs in ISI territory in Pakistan. And if you go back to that period, 1979, what we call the Golden Crescent wasn't a factor in the world drug traffic at all, which is amazing when you consider that now something like 90 or 93% of the world's heroin is coming from Afghanistan itself. And it went up very quickly from like an insignificant amount to, 2007 was the peak year, 8,200 tons. You mentioned that that was a huge buildup from 2001, when it was only 185 tons. I think in all fairness, we ought to compare the 8,000 figure with 2000 rather than 2001, because that 185-ton figure was a record low in the last 2 decades, because the Taliban was desperate to get world recognition. It was only recognized by 3 countries at that time. And so it just made a point of using its own brutal methods to stamp out the drug trade in Afghanistan. 185 tons was from most of that, nearly all of it, was from the area of Afghanistan that the Taliban did not yet control. And then in 2001, we went back in, so I say Washington, made a conscious decision to ally itself with the Northern Alliance, who were responsible for the drugs still being grown in Afghanistan. They went in with the aid of drug traffickers, and that has colored the nature of the relationship we have in that country ever since. This is not the first time. I mean, something very like this happened in Vietnam. America went into Vietnam in the 1950s, had no real allies there, and installed a puppet, really, Ngo Dinh Diem, and with very little popular base. He relied on his brother. This is just as Ahmed Karzai relies on his brother Ahmed Wali to deliver the votes, organize the countryside, also be a CIA asset, which he was.
And let me just stop you there, Peter, because that's actually in the mainstream news just yesterday. I was watching Wolf Blitzer, and the Cafferty report was coming on, and they were discussing how not only does Walid Karzai deal this opium, but he also rigs the elections for his brother. They were laughing about it. It was like an inside joke to them. They said, oh, I wonder if his brother is helping to rig the elections. This isn't very funny to me.
Well, history repeated becomes farce, I guess, because this is what we had in Vietnam. No Dinh Nhu ran the drug trade, was a CIA asset, and faked an election for his brother No Dinh Diem. Yes, it's painful that we say that we're doing this as a fight for democracy. It's actually meaningless to bring democracy to a country like Afghanistan. It's not even really a state in our sense. It's a collection of tribes, and it always had a certain amount of violence built into it. But it was a much more benign state of affairs before we started meddling, and particularly before we pumped all this money in behind the drug traffic, because the drug traffickers are much more ruthless than the traditional tribal elders who have their own code of behavior. And the idea that we can just go into a country and impose something on it and expect people to like us is ridiculous. It's like the British Redcoats coming to America in the 1770s and expecting to get rid of these miscreants like George Washington. It wasn't going to happen.
And again, instead of ending these wars like the Obama administration had promised, he's actually sent tens of thousands of new troops into Afghanistan, and the media propaganda that that's where the real fight is has really been thrust upon the people in the last 18 to 24 months. We have to be in Afghanistan. We have to have more troops in Afghanistan. We're going to have a troop shift into Afghanistan. What do you see that environment like in the next 2 years? Are we going to still just keep mounting troops, or when we get to an election year, will we start to pull them out a little more?
Well, I think Obama faces a very tough decision in the future. He might be, for all I know, I can't read his mind, he might be sincere in thinking that he's going to pull the troops out, because certainly the most sensible thing for him to do, given what he has done, which is put, we now have 100,000 troops there, and also don't forget, 100,000 mercenaries. Blackwater still has contracts with the government, now called Z, but it's the old Blackwater. And there are other private firms. It's 200,000 troops, and that's not enough by counterinsurgency doctrine to pacify the country. It's not even enough to pacify the Pashtun southern half of it, which is the basic source of the problem. I think he may think, and he may have been advised that he should pull out, but I agree with Andrew Basevich that once you unleash the dogs of war, it's not so easy to haul them back in, and America is going to find itself in a position, I will predict this, that in 2011, which was the year where he said he would begin to start pulling the troops back out, the situation is going to be at least as messy as it is now, and there's going to be a great deal of pressure on him, both from inside the country and from the area of Pakistan and Afghanistan itself, to stay in. In fact, the situation in Pakistan may be worse, for all I know, because it's a very unstable country right now.
And, you just mentioned that it would be like the Redcoats coming into America, what the United States has done in Afghanistan. I want to get your take on the video that was recently released this week of really soldiers being judge, jury, and executioner from the sky on not only Reuters reporters, but then when one of them seemed to survive, they opened up on a van with 2 children in the front seat of the car when no weapons were in sight. They kept saying, do you see a weapon? No, I don't see a weapon. Is he going for a weapon? Is he going for a weapon? Engage. And then they gunned that van down. Of course this is going to create an insurgency. Of course this is going to create a dislike of the United States and its policies.
Well, I'm glad that film got released, and I hope that the people listening to this show will make a point of finding it on Google, because it is a lesson in what war is like. particularly a war where, as is the case here in both Iraq and Afghanistan, our troops fighting there have very, very little exposure to the culture of the country. I'm talking about the people on the ground now. They're going in, raiding homes. They can't talk to these people. They rely on interpreters who are often not the most reliable people around. And there's so many other things to see on the web. There's another story on the web about Fallujah. Fallujah was the city which America made a point of attacking heavily in 2004 and created a great number of civilian casualties. And there's an article now about, because they used uranium in the weaponry there, and they also used they used a lot of new weapons which probably by UN standards are illegal weapons.